they were the darling of the space, went through some major transitions. People really didn't know what the outcome was going to be for this company. But it's almost like, look who's back, Jack, because, when you look at that data, don't sleep on MindMed, right? We didn't know who was going to be in drug development, what was going, whatever. But now that we understand a little bit more, and you being on the clinical model, it really doesn't matter which company is involved in which kind of trial. If their trials and positive data gets revealed and it's positive, kind of like what we learned from MindMed, that obviously is going to benefit you. So is the idea to build more and more collaborations with a lot of these drug development companies over time? Hey everyone, welcome to our latest Trade To Black podcast. Great to have you here on a Friday morning. We want to dive into the psychedelic space here this morning. Some big news involving MindMed yesterday and some really compelling data related to their phase 2B trial. What does this all mean? And in a lot of ways, how does this benefit other companies within the industry? You may be asking, what does this all mean? So let's break it down as we welcome back the CEO of Numinus Wellness, which trades on the TSX under the ticker symbol NUMI, Payton Nyquvest. Good to see you. And wow, that was some pretty compelling data that they announced yesterday, to say the least.
Yeah, and I mean, not only compelling data, but to follow that alongside with a $175 million private placement at a 1% discount to market. So essentially at market. Pretty, really kind of a transformative moment for the space. And obviously, right on the heels of MAPS, finishing their Series A and all that we've talked about in regards to their submission. So pretty incredible. And that data,
Is that some of the best data that you've seen?
No question. Yeah. Really, really incredible. And, with an indication like anxiety that, millions and millions and millions of people suffer with.
No kidding.
Pretty incredible.
That's a big audience when you think of anxiety. But listen, they had money, but we all know drug development, the burn rate is pretty hefty. So that $175 million obviously really answers a lot of questions or concerns that investors have, but it puts them into, look, they were the darling of the space, went through some major transitions. People really didn't know what the outcome was going to be for this company. But it's almost like, look who's back, Jack, because, when you look at that data, don't sleep on MindMed, right?
Yeah. No, look, and credit to Rob Barrow. I mean,
no kidding.
The CEO of MindMed, who first time, as an executive of a public company. And I mean, when he went in there, it was a mess. And I mean, he's
was wrong in the psychedelic space from the early days. Big names, promo, all that sort of stuff, when really, truthfully, at the end of the day, a lot of people didn't understand what his background was, as far as trying to sell the message. They didn't know who he was. They obviously liked the showman people that were there before. However, the problem is that the stock cratered. But now, from what I've heard, the right people with the right backgrounds are in place, and these things take time, as we always say. But in emerging industries, especially in this day and age with investors, they want everything yesterday. But it proves that, if you get the right people in place, especially in the biotech field. But these are staggering stats. I want to break into this. So when we look into this, it showed that 4 weeks after a single 100 microgram dose of MM-120, which is LSD, showed that 48% of participants achieved remission and no longer showed clinically significant anxiety. And then another 65% showed clinically meaningful improvement. So big numbers, to say the least. So, okay, everybody's watching this, and they might be asking, well, why is Rob Barrow not on? And why are we speaking to Payton Nyquvest? So we bring this up because the research was actually conducted at over 20 clinical trial sites with 198 participants. And your clinic, the Numinus Cedar Clinic Research, Draper, Utah, was actually one of the highest enrolling sites for the study, really the leading site. And Dr. Reed Robison, who is your chief clinical officer, was the principal investigator. So saying all this with all these results that we're outlining right now, with majority being studied at your clinic, does this not give you an idea of what's to come as these trials advance, and one day that we do see commercialization, that this is what it's going to look like and entail?
Mm-hmm. And I recognize that I'm probably a bit of a broken record on this,
Yep.
and have been saying the same thing for years. But it's such a unique opportunity for us to be able to enroll these clinical trials in our existing clinics with clients. They're usually clients of ours, that are getting access to these clinical trials, and it just gives us such a forward looking, experience of what does it really take to build the service infrastructure
Yep.
to be able to support people through this. And it's yes, it's important for kind of post approval, but even pre approval. And we've seen this, with the Compass, phase 3 study where a bunch of the sites failed. Like, I think that's an early indicator of the importance of a really good clinical therapeutic model,
Right.
because if you don't, you will not have good outcomes. And we were fortunate enough to be quoted in the MindMed press release, and fortunate enough to play a role in the success that they've had with those results. But I think whether you're looking at the MindMed results or whether you're looking at the MAPS results, the thing to underscore is the importance of training and good clinical infrastructure to be able to ensure the kinds of results that we're seeing in clinical trials.
So is that
And
where
if
we're
you
is that where we're at now within the industry? Like one could
Yeah.
ask, why are a lot of these participants and companies choosing you as the leading clinical site? And you've outlined the proper training, the proper infrastructure that's being built. Take me within those walls and the conversations that you have with a lot of these executives from other companies. Do they see the work that you're putting in, understanding that it's done the right way now that we're in this phase, so that we
Yeah.
better understand that not only this trial, but as more and more companies have advanced trials, is this kind of the brand that you've always worked and strived towards this, but are people within the space actually understanding it as well?
Yeah, I think people have started to understand a couple of things. One, it's kind of unfair to like call the psychedelic industry an industry. There's two industries within healthcare that have a psychedelic focus,
Okay.
right? And we've talked about this. There's pharmaceutical development,
Yep.
right? And then there's services
Correct.
and clinical services. And those are just two verticals within healthcare that are, have interest in psychedelics, right? I think a couple of years ago, there was just this broad brush of psychedelic industry. And as long as you had psychedelic in your presentation, that's what people were looking for. And that's a natural part of a kind of new, you call it industry or new investment opportunity.
Yep.
You see a lot of that, but I think that's gotten really clear for people over the last little bit.
It
And
has for me. When I think of some of the interviews I conducted a couple years ago, and I'm thinking, I can't even watch 2 minutes of this. There's so much we've learned. Even the people that were in the space have learned, right?
yeah, but for us and where Numinus has been fortunate is we've got people who work with us who have been in this work for an extremely long time. And that expertise is what we've leveraged to be able to build what we've built, and be in the position where a lot of these drug developers are really enlisting us to help do a pretty big part of the heavy
Yeah.
lifting to ensure the success of these clinical trials, because it isn't as easy as other pharmaceutical clinical trials where it's take a drug, let us know how you feel. With drug plus therapy, it's a complicated process,
Yeah.
and you have to be able to ensure a level of quality and a level of expertise to help the drug developer um, you know get the most out of their compounds. And similarly to that, and we've talked a lot about this too, but ultimately, you think about commercialization.
Yeah.
And I think, if you're looking at MindMed or Compass or Usona, a number of these drug developers that are sort of, call it, 2 to 3 years behind where MAPS is maybe at, right?
Yeah.
And, you've watched what MAPS and Lycos have gone through over the last little bit. They're an extremely exciting stage where, potentially come August, they've got MDMA approved for PTSD, but it's not a secret. They've been significantly underfunded the whole way through, and, probably haven't focused as much as they would have hoped to around commercialization.
Yeah.
And, regular pharmaceutical drug, the typical sales cycle to like get a drug kind of post approval into commercialization is usually like a 10-year process, right? And that's because they're developing a drug nobody's ever heard of before. Nobody's even thinks to look for it. And nobody really pays attention to the clinical trial results, right? Whereas with psychedelics, everybody's talking about it. It's in popular culture. You probably saw just I think yesterday or the day before, Dana Larson got business licenses for his illegal psychedelic drug dispensaries in BC.
Yeah.
Right. So, you're now seeing this everywhere. And the risk or the challenge for these drug developers is there's an overwhelming amount of demand and knowledge and education about psychedelic therapy.
You're dealing with the FDA. You want to make sure everything is done correctly. Right?
Yeah, but also, how are you going to try and achieve scale in a short period of time, right? And that's the challenge that all of these drug developers are up against. And so anyway, so getting back to my very long point, I think if you're MindMed or your Compass or your Sona or some of the, GH Pharma, some of the other big ones, they're probably sitting there looking at the MAPS process, and we were talking about this years ago. And I was trying to raise awareness to this then, saying, you need to start this process now.
Yep.
Training therapists takes time. Building clinic infrastructure takes time, and it's not a money issue.
Yes,
it's a time issue.
Yeah,
you could have all the money in the world. It still takes time to do this work, and so that's where Numinus has been focused.
I see, like, for example, like we cover the cannabis space as well, and we have a few companies that we have on that are like some of the biggest debt lenders in cannabis, and we always ask the question, what happens to you guys if we see rescheduling and banking starts to come in and the traditional banks start to get more and more involved? Do you become like yesterday's news? And a lot of the feedback is no, the banks are actually reaching out to us to basically, how do we put together like the underwriting and understand the industry, so it actually makes them more lucrative, even if more and more banks get involved. Now, as I pivot to the psychedelic space, like we've looked at established clinics like the Cleveland Clinic that's been involved in research trials with big pharma. When they look at this space right now, one could wonder, like, why wouldn't they as a clinical model get involved in this right now? Is it similar to what I'm saying in the cannabis space, where they want to look at companies like yourselves that are specializing in this field specifically, that have the established relationships and are really diving into this from day one? Is that?
Yeah, and this is not just in psychedelics. You've seen this in their business model lots of times. They're big organizations doing lots of things, and I think they're sitting back and kind of letting the dust settle a little bit, figure out who's got best practices, figure out who's done the roll up the sleeves work, and just enlisting in them to help. And I've shared this before, but we've had lots of those conversations with a lot of those big behavioral health networks, and they're watching. They're paying attention to the clinical trials. They're excited about it. Yeah, for sure. And look, like, you can best be sure, like the Lycos folks are on the phone trying to,
I bet.
But those are also, they're very big machines that take a very long time to, pivot and, go through, frankly, even just the bureaucracy of incorporating that kind of work, where we don't have that kind of bureaucracy, right?
It's established companies that have been around for decades, and everything that has to be done is done correctly. And that's why I think, if you're doing it right, there's no shortcut to success. And in a lot of ways, I think a lot of these, if the opportunity does present itself, they're obviously going to look at whether you're in drug development or the clinical model side, everything is done correctly. So I think one of the big things I've learned too from the early days in this space to where we are now, like, look, we didn't know who was going to be in drug development, what was going, whatever. But now that we understand a little bit more, and you being on the clinical model, it really doesn't matter which company is involved in which kind of trial. If their trials and positive data gets, revealed and it's positive, kind of like what we learned from MindMed, that obviously is going to benefit you. So is the idea to build more and more collaborations with a lot of these drug development companies over time?
No question. And that, that's why I built Numinus in the first place. And that it was always to be, a collaborator with, and it came from my conversations with Rick Doblin 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And Rick called it out then. He said, we're seeing lots of interest in the research of the drugs, but we're going to need a service infrastructure to actually be able to, have those be places where people can access these treatments. Yeah. And that was always the intention of Numinus, is how do we build a service center that can support all of these different drugs that are in different phases of approval, in a way that is sustainable and providing the best possible outcomes for clients. And so we want everybody to be successful. It's the reason why we're helping on clinical trials. It's the reason why we're helping on, training. And it's the reason why we're building a sustainable clinic business. They're all important parts of this, but also not parts that the drug developers can do. We've talked about this, but you can't, pharmaceutical drug companies cannot own service centers. There's conflicts of interest there.
Yes.
And so, that was really what we tried to help support was, we know what it takes to be able to offer these therapies, in the way that frankly is being shown in clinical trial work, and to train practitioners based off of all the experience that we've been able to capture as an organization.
So when we look at the psychedelic, as you said, one side's drug development, as you've indicated, you cannot own a clinical model as well. That's important. You've indicated that. So when I look at the advancements of a lot of these novel drug treatment, or I should say clinical trials that are taking place, what is that like? I would think that you're going to conduct a lot more of these trials within your clinics. So what does that translate into when it comes to revenue, knowing that you're managing a lot of these trials within your clinics and you're the leading trial site for what's going on?
Yeah, look, our clinical trial business is a lucrative one for us. The margins are quite high on clinical trial work, and I think what we've continued to establish ourselves is really sort of best in class. And you think, there's a number of very expensive clinical trials that are about to start to take more place in the psychedelic space, right? MindMed's now going to do a phase 3. You can be very sure that we'll be very involved with that. And again, and Compass kind of highlighted this, the risk is you have not good sites. You could take a $50 million speeding ticket on a bunch of phase 3 clinical trial data that you've got to go and replicate again, right? And that's a very real risk in the psychedelic space. So, that's kind of a unique opportunity for us to be able to capture that business, and will definitely be a focus of ours going forward, with also the intention of, the more active we can be in those clinical trials, the better of a commercialization partner we are once approved.
Yeah. Hence the reason why you're building those collaborations with those companies that are heading into phase 3 trials, right?
Correct.
Last thing I want to bring up, Lykos, formerly known as MAPS, when we look at their current trial and their NDA submission to the FDA, which received priority review, which you indicated in our last podcast, and really it's a strong sign that their MDMA protocol could be approved. And if it is approved, one could say they've basically have presented a blueprint for a lot of these companies like MindMed or another phase 3 like Compass, how to properly package their data research when it comes to presenting to the FDA. If that is indeed the case, knowing your collaboration with MAPS, how do you stem to benefit from something like that?
I think, and I've said this before, but I think anybody in the psychedelic space, particularly if you're in drug development, owes a huge debt of gratitude to the MAPS and Lykos team. The work that they've done is incredible. And, I think it was really interesting and cool to see that MindMed received that breakthrough therapy status as well, because you can kind of see how it's falling in the same groove that the MAPS and Lykos MDMA path was, and Compass as well. So I think if that gate can open for, call it, whether it's MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, but if that gate opens up, especially when you think about the process that MDMA is going to go through, first drug to go through full clinical trials, be approved by the FDA, the DEA rescheduling, how the FDA thinks about, the very non-sexy part of this that a lot of people don't think about, but like REMS and training and, what kind of registration practitioners are going to have, drug storage, all of those like MAPS is going to take all of that, sort of on the chin here over the next 6 months. And then there's a path, right? And then there's a path that can be ideated on, made better, learned from, that all of these drug developers, now get to follow. So I think it speeds up the process, streamlines the process. And frankly, for investors, you see one of these things get approved, and as long as the results continue to be positive, there's no reason to think that once MDMA is approved that, psilocybin won't be approved, LSD, 5-MeO DMT, all of these things that are coming, right? As long as the results are good, the sort of box that needed to get checked around, will the FDA approve and will the DEA reschedule a psychedelic drug, right?
So streamline quicker means quicker to commercialization, which means everything being conducted at your clinics.
Correct.
Interesting. One last thing, and I know I said last thing, but there was some comments that I was online earlier, and maybe you want to clear this up, but there's questions that pertain to the IP of MAPS related to their protocol, and that some people are predicting that it's like 6 years. And if you look at the trained therapists and the amount of clinics that need to be built across the US, that's going to be 3 to 5 years, not really leading them a lot of runway time, knowing that there could be only 6 years of IP. Is that being misunderstood by people? If so, can you maybe clear that up?
Yeah, Lykos is better to speak to it than I am, but you look at, they've looked at this for a long time. Compass has done the same sort of thing. So as the drug sponsor, right, as a sponsor of the clinical trial, typically you get data exclusivity for 8 to 10 years.
Okay,
right. They being just call it they being other psychedelic drug development companies, not just Lykos, have also looked at how do they protect their IP for longer periods of time.
Correct.
And so what I've mentioned before is when we're talking about approval, we're not talking about approval of just generic MDMA.
Correct.
Right? We're talking about approval of a Lykos formulation that is similar and akin to MDMA. And so what I would probably assume is that there will be patents and IP filed around the formulation process for creating that drug that they will own, that will probably greatly extend the protectability of their drug.
And the cloud's clear. Now I get it.
Yeah,
that makes complete sense, because I know we've talked a lot about it's not generic MDMA, it's their MAPS MDMA protocol. But when that does indeed happen, and they're the first drug to be approved, not the first, but for MDMA protocol approved by the FDA, that's when you can look at extension of IP, which could be 10 plus years, if I'm correct, right?
Well, and look, the one thing that flew under the radar that nobody's really been talking about is, Spravato, right? Which is Johnson & Johnson's ketamine drug, right? Which there is lots of other generic ketamine drugs out there, right? In year 2, they did $750 million in revenue. It's their number one performing drug.
I just can't believe when we look at some of the data that's being announced, like even with MindMed, 48%, 65%.
It's incredible.
Some of the most effective SSRIs are like less than 10.
Yeah, no, look, it's incredible. And, you know, I can't share, I can't share the experiences or anything that had happened in the clinical trials, but I can say a lot of these people are our clients.
Yeah.
And what we've been able to see people go through and come out the other side of is incredible. And, you know, we talked a lot about this, but at a time where it doesn't matter which mental health indication you look at, anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance abuse, everything is going up and going up dramatically. So, you know, we've reached a point of, you know, frankly, we reached the point many years ago, but we're at this point where we desperately need better forms of treatment. And, you know, these drugs are showing a huge amount of promise.
Well, I think the big thing I learned here today is there's always talks about Numinus and the collaboration that you have with Lykos. And where's that sit and how does that develop and how does that translate specifically into your story? But now what I'm seeing is that it's not just stopping and ending there. It's now that you're building more and more of this sustained, qualified clinical model that is done properly, which, you know, this press release from this morning obviously outlines a lot of that stuff. It's as more and more companies within the space are conducting extensive research trials that are advancing into the phase 3s, they're leaning towards your clinical model to conduct a lot of this stuff, which is promising to say the least. So it goes beyond just the Lykos model, which I would think that if there's positive data, so goes the drug development companies, so goes Numinus with it, correct?
Correct.
Well, listen, appreciate it. Hopefully our viewers get some good feedback and a little bit more direction as we continue down this story. But congrats, obviously, the MindMed team, or hopefully to get Robert Barrow on next week sometime. But now I kind of understand more as to why Dr. Robinson was commenting on that and being the lead research investigator involved in that specific trial. But now I see the correlation between the two. And be interesting to see as we start to see more and more trials advance. But all is watching as we inch closer towards the summertime, and hopefully we get some positive news from the FDA. Man, the industries I follow really depend on the FDA and the DEA, and it's just the waiting game. Anyways, listen, appreciate the time, and let's keep in touch.
Sounds great. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Payton.
Thanks so much.
So what'd you all think of the interview? Did you like what we recorded with our guests? Then leave a comment below and let us know what you thought of it. And if there's any more questions you want us to ask, as usual, share this video with your network. Click on that bell for all notifications. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel because we would not be here without you. Thanks for watching, everyone.